I'm Suzanne DiMaggio, Board Chair of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. On behalf of my colleagues, it's a pleasure to welcome all of you to today's discussion focused on advancing peace on the Korean Peninsula. I'd like to thank Women Cross DMZ and the American Conservative for partnering with us on this initiative. In these times of hyper-partisanship, it's a sign of progress that we can convene a transpartisan event that brings together different perspectives on the Korean issue and join forces to challenge the conventional wisdom about what's possible. I also would like to thank Congressman Khanna for providing remarks today. He's been a tireless champion of ending the Korean War and a strong advocate for responsibly managing relations with countries like North Korea and China. Today marks the 67th anniversary of the Korean War armistice. I think many Americans would be surprised to learn that although the armistice was signed in 1953, the war never officially ended because there was no peace treaty. How we approach the legacy of the Korean War is often too exclusively focused on issues related to militarism and non-proliferation at the expense of peace and diplomacy. 70 years after the Korean War began, it's long past time to think through alternatives. The Quincy Institute was established to do just that, to open up the space for debate, to question long-held assumptions, and to put forward new ideas and solutions, with the aim of moving U.S. foreign policy away from endless war and toward vigorous diplomacy in the pursuit of international peace. An important part of this effort is public educational endeavors, such as today's discussion, to promote dialogue and mutual understanding. And it's in that spirit I'm grateful to all of you for tuning in to join us. We're fortunate to have a great group of speakers to guide us through this long-standing conflict and to help us consider how the United States can finally end this painful chapter of our history. Thank you.
Welcome, and thank you for signing on to this wonderful program. I think the title says it all, Ending 70 Years of War. This is an enormous goal, but I am so proud to be part of such a dedicated group of people who have come together under the singular notion that peace on the peninsula can be accomplished if we combine our strength against the status quo forces of US foreign policy in Washington today. I'd like to thank Women Crossing DMZ and the Quincy Institute for inviting me as a representative of the American Conservative to co-sponsor this important event. For those who may not know, our magazine has stood for truth and restraint in foreign policy since the run-up to the 2003 Iraq War. We oppose the invasion as an unnecessary war of choice and a dangerous exercise in American exceptionalism. That is why the magazine was indeed founded. For 20 years, we have been consistently critical of Washington's militaristic approach to solving our differences overseas and our desire to police the world. We have called for an end of the post-war order that has insisted on American primacy and hegemony, and the idea that we must impose our views and our interests on everyone in order to keep the world safe. We believe TAC represents a bedrock of conservative thinking, encapsulated in Washington's farewell address, in which he said that overseas foreign entanglements would eventually drag the country into wars we had no business fighting and harm American interests at home. This is the conservatism also that animated President Eisenhower's own farewell address, in which he warned that the Cold War would create a military-industrial complex that would eventually turn war into a business that would dominate and corrupt the polity at home. We see both presidents' warnings in our role on the Korean Peninsula today. For decades, presidents have been swayed by forces in our military-industrial complex to take the hardline position in talks with North Korea, imposing terrible, higher risk sanctions, demanding nuclearization before any offer of peace and concessions on our side. There's been little attempt to think creatively about approaching peace from the prospects of bringing our troops home after 70 years to containing rather than eliminating nuclear weapons on the peninsula as a path to reconciliation. These are only but a few issues that our experts will be discussing today. I thank the organizers for having the vision to bring foreign policy thinkers from all sides of the spectrum here. That is what Washington has been lacking. The trust that independent thinking outside of the status quo might get us on the path for peace. Right now, under President Trump, there is a hole where strong national security and foreign policy should be. Maybe that's not such a bad thing. Maybe that's where the strength of our coalition could have a real impact. And there is no better way to start than right now. So thank you for joining us, and I look forward to the rest of the program.
Thank you, Suzanne, Kelley, and everyone at the Quincy Institute and the American Conservative for co-hosting this roundtable on how the U.S. can advance a peace agreement with North Korea. Today is a significant day because 67 years ago, military commanders from the U.S. and North Korea put down their weapons and signed an armistice agreement. Although they recommended that their respective governments return within 90 days to negotiate a permanent peace settlement, that never happened. It is precisely because there was never a formal conclusion to the Korean War that we find ourselves in the security crisis we are in today, where nuclear war could break out at any time. At Women Cross DMZ, we've been leading a global movement of women to end the Korean War with a peace agreement. That's because we know that when women are involved in peace processes, not only does it lead to an actual peace agreement, it leads to one that lasts. Women peacemakers are successful in ending conflicts because of their willingness to cross the line, whether it's ethnic, religious, national, or ideological. And in keeping with that spirit, today's forum features a diverse array of experts across the political spectrum. They and the organizations co-sponsoring the event today in no way endorse everything that will be said. Still, we believe it is important to come together across the political spectrum to show consensus for formally ending the US's longest standing overseas conflict. These perspectives will be part of a forthcoming report produced by the Korea Peace Now campaign this fall. One key takeaway from that report is that the status quo, whether in the form of the Trump administration's maximum pressure campaign or the Obama administration's strategic patience, has failed. It's failed to achieve denuclearization or improved human rights. In fact, Women Cross DMZ believes that peace is the precondition for denuclearization and improved human rights, not the other way around. We are honored to have today Congressman Khanna, who has been a progressive champion for peace in Korea and introduced House Resolution 152 calling for an end to the Korean War. He will be followed by Doug Bandow of the Cato Institute, who will make the conservative case for peace with North Korea. We hope this discussion will spark more and broader conversations on the urgent need to end the Korean War. We must do it not only for the millions of Korean people who have lived with the constant threat of war and have been divided for 3 generations, but for all of us here in the United States who no longer want to wage endless wars and invest trillions of dollars on weapons of mass destruction. Now more than ever, it's imperative that we invest in these things: healthcare, housing, education, and the environment, so that we can have true human security.
I want to thank the Quincy Institute and American Conservative for hosting such an important conversation about our foreign policy towards the Korean Peninsula. On our policy towards the Korean Peninsula, as some of you know, I have introduced a resolution that passed through the House to formally end the armistice and bring peace. I believe, having spoken with senior advisors to President Moon, that such an initiative by the United States would go a long way to facilitating the peace process. If the United States moves first, if we have a peace declaration, that I think will incentivize Kim Jong-un to take actual steps towards denuclearization. And the advisors we've talked to in South Korea say that the United States really has little to lose by taking that first step. If we take that first step, we increase the possibilities for the leaders on the Korean Peninsula to take action. And then we need to have real negotiation. I supported the president's efforts in reaching a diplomatic solution. I think President Moon has articulated a framework. John Bolton, unfortunately, was an impediment to that. But hopefully, Vice President Biden, when he becomes president, would take up an initiative for diplomacy. Obama never had Moon as a partner. Now there is a partner. In fact, I was going to go to South Korea before COVID with Andy Briggs to meet with President Moon and see how we could move forward. I plan to do that after COVID and really will be supporting diplomatic efforts in the Korean Peninsula. All the experts from Secretary Perry, who almost had a deal in the 90s until Bolton ripped it up, to the foremost experts like Secretary Ernest Moniz, all of them believe that we need diplomacy, that ultimately you can have a solution in Korea if we move towards peace, if we move towards economic empowerment. We can always have snapback provisions in terms of any diplomacy deal with North Korea, but we have to recognize there isn't here a military solution. I look forward to listening to the panel and hearing the advice of the experts, and look forward to engaging with everyone to make sure we're continuing to push for a permanent peace resolution, an end to the armistice, an end to the war, and to a resolution of this long conflict.
Well, it's a great pleasure for me to join our friends at the Quincy Institute, American Conservative, and Women Cross the DMZ. You know, the Korean Civil War is still with us. You know, we still have a potential conflict on the peninsula. This is a very good time, obviously, to be talking about these issues, and I'm very pleased to help participate and welcome those who are speaking, as well as everyone who's viewing. This is a critical issue, one that should be addressed. And the next president, whoever that is going to have this as a responsibility. That what we see, I think, is that there's no panacea. This has been a conflict with us for decades. No easy answer. I think that we need to step beyond partisanship and acknowledge that President Trump at least deserves credit for willingness to engage the North. This was something which virtually no policymaker in Washington wanted to do. No previous president ever did. So he helped at least start us on the way towards a potential solution to the conflict that we have today. The question is, what should we do? It's very hard. I hope the participants here have some good ideas. I think we can look back to the Singapore statement. It was very short, but it at least gave us a bit of a roadmap in terms of what North Korea wanted. And frankly, we have to look at what North Korea wants if we hope to get an agreement with North Korea. You know, the first is better bilateral relations with the United States and North Korea. All of us should desire that. It makes no sense, in my view, to bar travel between the U.S. and North Korea. We want more, not less, people to go between both countries. The idea of a liaison office, the idea of some level of diplomatic recognition, some level of communication is very important. Imagine a Cold War if the U.S. didn't talk to the Soviet Union. You know, and we saw the consequences of not talking to the People's Republic of China for a quarter century. The more dangerous the regime, the more dangerous the situation, the more we need that communication. That's something which the US and North Korea could remedy. We also need to look at the kind of a peace regime for the peninsula. The good news is the war has stopped. There's been, deaths and things over the years, but nevertheless, the conflict has ended. Why not recognize that? We could see a peace declaration. We could talk about negotiation over a formal peace treaty. These are things that would recognize what we see today. They would help reduce tensions, I believe. And finally, they address the question of denuclearization. Many of us are skeptical that the North will give up its nuclear weapons, but there's also a very real possibility to approach this in practice as arms control. What kind of deals can we get that make the peninsula more stable and safer, and hopefully move us on the road to ultimate denuclearization? We need to explore those. We can't expect to get everything at once, but I think a serious, a committed administration, an effort at negotiation, this is a moment not to lose. And let's be realistic. There is nothing to, no reason to be certain we're going to get a good outcome. We have 70 years of frustration dealing with the Korean Peninsula, but let's not lose this opportunity. President Trump, for all of his faults, has opened up options here. Kim Jong-un, this is no liberal, but he seems interested at least in a new direction for U.S. North Korean relations. Let's take advantage of this opportunity. And this is the moment to do so. Let's do so quickly if we can. Let's set the stage for the next president who comes in. I want to thank again the sponsors. This is an issue which needs to be taken up. These groups have been willing to move us forward. I want to applaud everyone who's taking part in this conference. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you to everyone who's just tuned in and all the speakers who have been so adaptable to these virtual times. We're now going to move into our roundtable featuring several people that I'm sure you're all familiar with. So I will keep the introductions brief and ask that our panelists turn their videos on at this time. Our esteemed moderator is Dr. Catherine Moon, Professor of Political Science and the Wasserman Chair of Asian Studies at Wellesley College. She was the inaugural holder of the Korea Chair at the Brookings Institution. She's a member of the Harvard Kennedy School Korea Working Group, the National Committee on North Korea, and is an affiliated faculty at the Korea Institute, Harvard University. Our panelists include Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis, a senior fellow and military expert for defense priorities, Henri Ferron, non-resident senior fellow at the Center for International Policy, Jessica Lee, senior research fellow in the East Asia program here with the Quincy Institute, Adam Mount, senior fellow and the director of the Defense Posture Project at the Federation of American Scientists, and Dr. Hazel Smith, who is a professorial research associate in Korean Studies at the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London, and is currently also a fellow at the Wilson Center. I'm really looking forward to this panel. We will have time for audience Q&A in about 30 minutes. If you would like to submit a question, you can do so through the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom window. But we are going to dedicate the next 30 minutes to the panel. So with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Moon.
Thanks very much, Catherine. And again, welcome to everyone who's joining us. I'm very glad to participate in this roundtable. It's very nice to have not only diverse backgrounds in terms of political affiliations and perspectives, but also issue areas. And I think all of the three organizations have done a really good job in finding not only the right people, but also the relevant topics. Before we move to the first person, Daniel Davis, I just want to offer a bit of context. I was requested to do that before we start the roundtable. And we've had wonderful introductions, thought-provoking ones by our various speakers. Mine is a reminder that when we talk about the 67th anniversary of the Korean War armistice, what are we talking about? Yes, it was a document signed by two generals on the US side and on the North Korean side. And so what am I leaving out? Whom am I leaving out? Which actors? There were so many involved, including the numerous countries that now we forget about that participated as part of the UN command. So this was not just a civil war. It was primarily a civil war. It was not just about the Cold War, the first hot war of the Cold War. It was in many ways a global war, although technically we study it as a regional war. Why global? Because of the numerous countries from Turkey and so many others whom we normally don't factor in to discussions when we think about the Korean War. It affected so many people's lives around the world who gave their lives literally and who fought there and who hold on to the memories and have passed them down to their younger generations over time. So it is a part of global history, not just regional, not just bilateral US, South Korean, North Korean, inter-Korean history. The second thing I want to remind us is that the armistice, I think, has given us a false sense of stability and, quote, security. We don't have security with an armistice because, as we all know, technically the war has not ended. And in truth, the armistice has been violated hundreds of times by North Korea, by South Korea, and by the United States. The third point, the issue that most of us are so concerned about when we talk about the security of the peninsula, security of the region, nuclear issues. Nuclear weapons are one of the consequences of the armistice terms having been violated, first by the Americans, then by the North Koreans, and during Park Chung-hee's era, he had toyed with the idea of introducing South Korean produced nuclear weapons. So is the armistice the answer for stability? Not really, but it has given a false sense of daily stability to many in South Korea, even North Korea, and in the region. And I think that is part of the problem, this false sense of stability that people have taken for granted. In truth, it is a precarious state, a costly state of simply non-combat, where a lot of economic development has been allowed to take place in the South, and where human lives have deteriorated more in the North. So it is not our answer. And today we will hear from people who will not only pose questions, but hopefully lead us in a path toward some clearer answers toward true peace. We'll start off with Mr. Daniel Davis. He has direct on-the-ground experience in South Korea as a member of the U.S. Armed Forces when he was stationed there. And we'll start with Mr. Davis and go through the roster of panelists. Mr. Davis.
Yeah, thanks for having me on here. I truly do am very grateful for the opportunity to talk about these things, because especially from the perspective of the military, I don't think people give enough thought of that. They seem to think, in kind of geostrategic terms, but not as much in the practical terms. And I can just tell you, as someone who did serve a lot on Korea, have spent extensive time on the ground to understand what a war would be like there. I've fought in 4 different conflicts, to include high intensity tank on tank things, and all the way down to counterinsurgencies in the Middle East. And I can tell you that a war there would be just catastrophic. And so from a military perspective, the best thing for American national security is to work towards a peace, because the absence of peace, whether it's the armistice or anything else, means that we have to continue to put billions, scores of billions of dollars every single year into our alliance with South Korea, our troops in Japan. All of those things are predicated on having or on the absence of a peace agreement. So the best thing we can do is to work towards a peace agreement that will lower the tensions, that will lessen the need for military spending and military presence on there. It will increase our ability to defend America, because we don't have to focus just on North Korea. And it will also help our country out, because we won't have to spend as much money. In every way you want to talk about it, militarily, it is best, definitely in America's interest, to work towards a peace and to get rid of this armistice situation.
Apologies. Thank you so much. Such brevity and substance. Next, we'll move on to Jessica Lee, who is with the Quincy Institute and has been a key member of putting this event together. Jessica, words and thoughts on the U.S.-ROK relationship?
Sure, Kathy, thank you so much. It's an honor to be on the same panel as you and with our distinguished co-authors of the report that I've been able to contribute to. I will just start off with some brief remarks, but I first want to say, to your point, Kathy, the Korean War sometimes is seen as an abstraction because it happened so many years ago. But for people like us who are Korean American, we obviously have family members and relatives and have a lot of stories of wartime living. For example, my father often reminds me that growing up in the middle of the war, his family had nothing. So they actually made pants out of rice bags. And he to this day, he does not eat potatoes because he's so sick of eating potatoes, which was sort of the only thing they could afford at the time in the 50s. And so, you know, I carry these stories with me, and I think it's just a really stark reminder that this is actually a war that has continued on all these years. And people on the peninsula has never found closure. And so they live in the current, you know, sort of that state of war. And I think that says a lot about, you know, their state of security and stability. So I want to kind of share a couple of initial insights and look forward to the Q&A as well. You know, as we know, the U.S.-South Korea relations has had many ups and downs since the two countries recognized formal relations back in 1882. Last December, I wrote a Quincy brief for my think tank where I analyzed the history of this bilateral relationship and argued that a peaceful resolution of the Korean War is actually in U.S.'s strategic interest, as Danny just described, because what it would do in part is strengthen South Korea, a U.S. democratic ally, and South Korea's ability to gradually manage its own defense like a normal country. In our upcoming report with my co-authors who are here today, I also showed that efforts by Republican and Democratic administrations to denuclearize North Korea have failed precisely because of this broader question of the Korean War and the fact that that question has been left unaddressed. So our inability to end this war has really colored U.S.-South Korea alliance and the possibility of a more enduring peace and stable East Asia writ large. So, you know, I want to end by saying, you know, we see a lot of, you know, articles in the media and the newspapers about the ongoing special measures agreement. And that's, you know, of course, the document that governs how much a country contributes to the cost of hosting U.S. forces. And I think the broader debate of the future of U.S. military presence in East Asia is both healthy and needed. But unfortunately, President Trump seems to be approaching this in an unusual and public way. And so I worry that these negotiations, because you know, they are so sensitive, you know, it should be about give and take. And I think it requires more listening on the part of Washington and Seoul. And so, you know, I think, you know, finally, I raise that issue because, you know, obviously many of us in Washington have been following the recent debates on the National Defense Authorization Act, NDAA. And in that debate, you know, there was this language about what to do with the US troops in South Korea. And I think, you know, there continues to be on the part of the foreign policy establishment here, you know, this preference for just indefinitely prolonging, you know, US presence there. And I think that's really dangerous. And I think we need to talk about why we need to have troops there and how that fits into this warlike situation that Danny and you, Kathy, just described in terms of the peninsula. I look forward to delving into these issues further with you.
Thanks so much, Jessica. Next, we have Hazel Smith, who joins us from England. It's nighttime there, Hazel.
No, it's yes, but it's still light because we're the north. I'll be quick, and thank you, Kathy, and thank you to everybody who's organised this. You know, I've been working on North Korea and in and out of the United States for nearly 30 years now, and I think this is the first time I've ever seen a bipartisan initiative. So real congratulations, and I think that's a step forward in itself. I was asked to very briefly in this 5 minutes talk about the possibility of a peace agreement in terms of human rights. And I think that the implication was that in terms of US foreign policy, because this is a US mainly audience. I can't offer a sophisticated discussion in 5 minutes, so please forgive me if there's some things that I leave out, but there is one or two things I want to say. And I think in summary, the context is that so far we haven't got very far in the last 20 or 30 years. We've ended up with the potential instrument of war being thrown out as too catastrophic. We've ended up with regime change as being seen as not very successful in most other countries of the world where it's been tried. And so we've ended up with a sort of intermittent do nothing, come do something, but nothing really very strategic. So I think if we're looking at a peace treaty, its advantage to me is that it's an achievable, concrete aim. It's not a very, it's something that could be achieved. It's limited, and that again would be its advantage. And it could set the ball rolling in terms of opening up channels for the improvement of the well-being of North Koreans, which human rights campaigners want to see and which North Koreans themselves want to see. And I want to talk about why that might be in the couple of minutes that I've got left. the issue of peace treaty, of course, is that it's an agreement between two sovereign states. So there are many limitations to it, or more, or maybe even international organization, but because of its nature, there are limitations. Because if you accept sovereignty and to sign an agreement with a sovereign state, you accept that you don't interfere in the internal affairs of the states who are parties to that agreement. Now, you might think that that's quite a big limitation if you're talking about wanting to support human rights in North Korea, because if the United States and the DPRK sign a peace treaty, unless North Koreans agreed, there could not be domestic caveats regarding human rights concerns. But having said that, there would be very, very major advantages, I think, in terms of human rights concerns. First of all, a peace treaty which was really signed, a concrete peace treaty, would be accompanied by the other issues, not the least probably being at least a partial lifting of sanctions and the allowing of foreign investment to go to North Korea. I mean, that would be the big incentive for North Korea, and it would be something that private and public investment would want to see. But for the North Korean government to attract the level and quality of foreign investment that it wanted, either from the private sector like big international companies or from the public sector like the World Bank, it would have to, as China did, install guarantees, property rights, a new legislative system, a new system in which both businesses and, crucially, individuals had rights against the state. And that would be the first time that that would happen. If there was multilateral public investment, this would also bring a degree of accountability and transparency to transactions, not the least being work standards, which would have to be reports outside the country. Now, you might think this is a very limited vision, because after all, in China, you might argue that you've still got a politically authoritarian system. But for those of you that knew China 20 years ago and that know China today, in terms of the well-being and living standards and even the civic and personal space for individuals, you would see a massive difference in terms of the rights of individuals in China. The system in China used to be called, it still is called, the Danwei system. And that meant that, as in North Korea today, if you wanted to do anything, if you wanted to get married, if you wanted to get travel, if you wanted a job, if you wanted to go to a particular university, you had to have permission from the party through the local workplace. That is the nominal system in North Korea today. That's disappeared with foreign investment. It's simply disappeared. So again, we have to distinguish between personal and civic space, which has expanded in China, and also in terms of the political space in which there are still, as we know, concerns.
Hazel, apologies. Forgive me. I'm being told we have less time than we thought. If you could wrap up and then continue in Q&A.
So I don't think we should have major ambitions in terms of human rights, but I do think we can have very big ambitions for what could follow from a peace agreement, and particularly, not the least, getting some movement going where there's stasis right now.
Thank you so much. Apologies again. So we move on to Adam Mount.
Hi, thanks very much, and thanks for putting this together. The salient fact that strikes me about US policy towards North Korea is that this bargain where the United States can leverage economic and military and diplomatic pressure against the regime to force rapid disarmament has failed. It is no longer achievable or realistic to expect that more pressure put on the regime will disarm North Korea in the foreseeable future. Unfortunately, that leaves us in a position where there aren't many phenomenal options. But the alternative is not a circumstance in which you open the doors and accept North Korea as a nuclear power. It's not clear what that would mean or what that cosmetic step would mean. And frankly, it's not clear what could do that more than a series of high-level presidential summits. The alternative has been contributed to by the South Korean government and has been proposed in a group that I helped manage with Andrea Berger called the International Study Group on North Korea Policy, where 14 experts from all over the world or in the US and allied countries proposed an alternative approach to North Korea, which is to build the conditions for eventual disarmament, to shape North Korea's internal transformation, and to stabilize the security environment on the peninsula. It's incumbent on us to recognize that if North Korea is not going to disarm for the foreseeable future, we can't continue this policy where we are incentivizing North Korea to continue to expand and diversify its nuclear arsenal in really destabilizing ways, that we shouldn't incentivize them to build this incredibly sophisticated, clandestine global procurement network to continue to fund their abuses and activities. And we need to gain a greater margin of influence over how North Korea's internal evolution shapes, including for human rights, gender equality, and economic empowerment of non-governmental agencies. All of this is critical to the United States and South Korean and Japanese interests over the long term. Deterrence is not a long-term solution. Eventually it will break down, eventually it will crack. The critical thing now is to build the conditions for a more stable relationship over the long term, which is now critical not only for disarmament, but in the interim for the national security and other interests of the United States and its allies.
Many thanks to you, Adam. And we now have next Henry Ferron.
Oh. So ending the Korean War is obviously key to inter-Korean reconciliation as well. The bottom line is that the two Koreas are neighbors, and that the minimum for good neighborly relations is to put down the guns and renounce settling disputes through use of force. So both Koreas have called for a peace agreement with the participation of the United States. As long as those basics are down, there's legitimate interrogations about what peace means for the relationship between the two Koreas. After all, the conflict started as a civil war between the two governments that both claim to be the legitimate representative of the Korean people. So the question would arise, does peace then imply reunification, or does it imply recognition of the other state as a separate state? And those are questions that can make or break peace talks. They broke down on that account, notably in Geneva in 1954. And in the end, neither peace nor reunification was achieved. But years of inter-Korean talks have shed light on those answers, have shed light on the answers to those questions. Peace and reunification are treated as separate issues, for instance, in the Panmunjom Declaration. And that's only right, because the essence of a peace agreement is to stop the use of threat of force, whereas the essence of reunification is a much larger question of merging two states that have developed very differently in the past 70 years. And the two Koreas agree on a consensual reunification that aims first at some sort of coordinated coexistence between the two systems. And then there might be different views about how this goes later on. But what's clear is that they are treated as separate issues now. And what's also clear is that the two Koreas recognize each other enough to conclude binding agreements with each other. Officially, they define themselves as in a special interim relationship, but any interrogations about whether that ruled out binding agreements have been dealt with through the adoption of laws on inter-Korean relations in the early 2000s. So the two Koreas have a clear path to reconciliation, and a peace agreement is part of that path. They need, however, the participation of the United States to effectively reduce military tensions and thereby create a foundation for progress in that area. As to how a peace agreement would help achieve a stable Northeast Asia, what it would look like and what it should include, who should be a party, there's broadly two conceptions about what a peace agreement should look like. Either we aim for a grand bargain that tries to resolve everything, or we think of a peace agreement as a first step as the foundation of reconciliation and nonviolence that allows the resolution of the other outstanding issues. And the Panmunjom Declaration between the two Koreas rightly takes the latter approach. It proposes first an end war declaration, then a peace agreement to replace the armistice, and finally a peace regime to address all the other outstanding issues. And in that sense, a peace agreement should be a final settlement of the war involving the two Koreas, the United States, and optionally China. Usual peace topics such as borders or POWs have already been largely addressed in the armistice. And what all that's really needed at this point right now is to formalize that peace through a legally binding renunciation of wartime rights to use force. And in the process of getting to that, there will be again and again the temptation to try to make a peace agreement the panacea that resolves everything. But what's important to remember is when we use or try to use peace as a bargaining chip for other issues, be it nuclear, human rights, US-Korea relations, inter-Korean relations, that completely changes the nature of negotiations. And conditioning peace on one side laying down arms, for instance, is more like a demand of surrender than a peace offer. So it's technically possible to include these other issues in a peace agreement if politically necessary, but they should be negotiated through give and take on their own terms.
Thank you so much. And we're keeping excellent time. We're actually ahead. What I'd like to do is move to Q&A, and we have questions that have come in, and I have been going through the list of questions. And I will take some questions specifically and share them with all who are participating. At other times, I will create a composite question based on certain components or several questions so that we might save time. So the first question is a composite. There are people who've been asking about very specific obstacles to creating peace and a peace treaty. And also, is it a pie in the sky, a pie in the sky aspiration? Are those of us who might wish for such an instrument to come to fruition, are we all fantasizing rather than having our feet grounded in reality? So I want to ask every panelist for just a one-word answer about what you think is the most challenging or important obstacle to creating peace and or a peace treaty. And then secondly, is peace unrealistic when we're dealing with a despotic leader in North Korea, when we're dealing with so many different political actors who might have interests? So why don't we start in reverse order with Henry?
One word is challenging, but I'll say less is more.
But what do you think is a specific obstacle or challenge to creating peace or a peace regime?
Well, as I was mentioning just before, I think the part of the obstacle is that people want to solve everything in a peace agreement, whereas in my view, at least, the better approach would be to see it as the first step, establishing a foundation where people agree, okay, we won't use force to resolve these issues, but we will resolve these issues later on. And I think that's probably one of the biggest obstacles, to trying to put too much into that motion.
Okay, so the wish list would be too big, too grand, and that would become an obstacle in and of itself. Adam.
Thanks. I think the biggest challenge is to design an agreement and ensure compliance with an agreement that would serve as part of a movement to a broader peace process. And I think it would make sense to do a peace declaration as part of that, to lend momentum to that process as progress is being made. It doesn't have to be a grand bargain, but I think it's critical that a peace agreement is made or a peace declaration is made as part of this process of building momentum to larger agreements later. Incredibly difficult to design, requires flexibility on our part and on the North Koreans' part. But that's got to be the objective now.
Thanks. Hazel? Your audio, please.
So interested in what people have to say. I think were this to go forward in a sustained manner, then the issue would be getting the domestic constituencies in the United States behind it to see that this was a matter which supports the US national interest, both in Congress and in the wider NGO think tank community.
Thank you. Domestic politics. And Jessica.
Yes, thank you. Hazel set me up nicely for my answer. I think the answer is actually 3 words: military-industrial complex. To elaborate, former Secretary of Defense Robert Gates had said Washington has become overly dependent on military tools to address every foreign policy challenge, and this is no exception. So I think we have to recognize that this military-industrial complex, which was born out of the Korean War, really thrives in a world of threats, both real and imagined. And so, as Hazel pointed out, if there's a domestic constituency that says no, this endless war and war making and profiteering from war has to end. We have other priorities here at home to address. I think that's when we can start to see a change, both on the Korean Peninsula as well as elsewhere.
And Danny, please.
Yeah, one word: mentality. We have to change the mentality, because we've been operating, as this whole thing is called here, for 70 years, that there has to be a state of conflict or a state of war technically existing. We have the mentality of the Cold War, where North Korea is always the enemy. Everything that happens is always their fault, and vice versa. And until both sides are willing to have the mentality, but we, I think, as the stronger nation, need to start with changing the mentality that says, all right, we're going to start going from a wartime mentality to a peacetime mentality. And that's why I think having an end of war declaration as a first step is crucial, because then you can get to a bunch of other steps. If you don't get that one thing changed, it's hard to get anything of substance done.
Thank you so much. The next question is another composite. There are numerous questions from the audience that pertain to the different actors who should, who could, who would be involved in a peace process. So if you all could talk a little bit about that and try not to repeat what someone else has said. Who are the actors that need to be involved? One of the questions was more specific. Couldn't and shouldn't North and South Koreas just simply work it out, tell the United States what the terms are, and then we have follow through after that? Who has the legitimate legal capacity to actually sign a peace treaty, and so on? So these are really excellent questions, conceptually and practically speaking. So if we could have perhaps Adam, if you might start us off with some aspect of the answers, and then we'll move on from there.
Thanks. I think Henri will be very well positioned to talk about the legal aspects of this. What jumps out to me from a political perspective is how important it is to coordinate between the United States and its allies. If we think of peace building as a sequence of effective measures to transform our relationship with North Korea, rather than a sort of a cosmetic signature or declaration, the critical thing is that we're all on the same page, that the United States, South Korea, and Japan are coordinating economic outreach towards North Korea, that they have an effective plan not only for alleviating certain sanctions measures as part of an agreement process that's ongoing, but also sort of providing economic incentives, that our defense and national security strategies are synced up so that they support this process of building a more sustainable relationship with North Korea, rather than continuing to pile on and layer on sort of levels of threat that are unconstructive in this regard. You don't want one country sort of breaking off and trying to sort of undermine the efforts of other allies and partners. And so that's a huge diplomatic challenge. And I think it requires a transformation in the perspective and the tenor of the conversations within different alliance partnerships. No longer can we rely on this convenient fiction that North Korea is going to disarm by the end of the year. We need a more sustainable foundation for our alliance relationships and our policies towards North Korea, which has to be about managing the threat and the challenge from the regime, but also transforming our relationship with it.
Jessica Lee, you want to continue a bit on alliances?
Sure. I mean, I think, just going back to the question about ending the Korean War, though, and then of course I could tie it to the alliance more broadly, but, I think, one of the things we have to remember is that signaling the end of the Korean War in and of itself doesn't legally end the war. That declaration would follow a sort of a formal treaty of non-aggression pact of some kind that is signed by the representatives of North Korea, China, and the UN command. And so I think what advocates, of a peace declaration have said is that just declaring that US is no longer engaged in a war with North Korea could catalyze the legally binding agreement that would follow that. And so I think that's important. The broader question of the alliance is something that, I think most analysts are watching very closely, particularly given, as I said, the context of the SMA and the fact that Japan will soon be also negotiating its own SMA with the United States this fall. And so we want to, think of the relationship between US and South Korea and other allies, not so much in the context of a military relationship. I mean, that's what an alliance is, right? But if we were to disentangle the war of the Korean War with other aspects of bilateral relations with strong, democratic, like-minded countries, we can begin to forge a new relationship, one that isn't so driven by threat calculus, but something that is more holistic, perhaps with much more focus on trade, people-to-people diplomacy, and other aspects of statecraft that really we haven't really seen in recent years because of our hyperfixation on the military.
Daniel, would you give us your thoughts, please, on this composite question?
There's a lot of people that need to be involved with it. I mean, you've talked about China, Russia, Japan, United States, South Korea, North Korea. Those all need to be involved. But in my view, unequivocally, we need to move front and center the two nations that have the most to gain and the most to lose from peace working or not working, and that is South Korea and North Korea. And I think President Moon Jae-in from South Korea has done a masterful job in very, very difficult circumstances, navigating both domestic politics, international politics, and cross-border politics. And I think that giving him more power to do some negotiations and us supporting what was going to happen there, I think that has the best chance to get through, certainly better than a maximum pressure campaign military lead by the United States. That's about the best way to make it not work. So I definitely would lobby for South Korea to take the lead on diplomacy.
And Hazel, please.
I like the aspiration of what Daniel had to say, but I slightly disagree in that I think that every single major participant in the conflict in the region, in the United States and elsewhere, sees that if not de jure, de facto, it's United States DPRK relations that are at the core of the whole conflict, and any future instruments of which the peace agreement could be one or a peace declaration could be one would have to be at least informally signed on to by the United States and the DPRK, because it's the resolution of conflict between them that matters. In terms of the de jure arrangements, at the moment, the United Nations on sanctions towards North Korea has outsourced diplomacy to the United States. So there would be nothing wrong in reversing that order if a peace declaration could be worked out informally between the various protagonists. And of course, South Korea would have a major part to play because it's played the negotiating bridge over the last few years. If that could be worked out, then a forum for doing it could be the United Nations Security Council, which would which would give a degree of universality to the proceedings. But unless it was signed on also either politically or legally by the United States administration, by Congress and by Senate, then I think it would not carry the weight, the political weight, which would be needed to open up the logjam, the strategic logjam in the region.
Thank you. Henry, if you could have the last word on this question and focus on legal, procedural issues related to developing a peace regime and specifically a potential peace agreement. One question specifically asked, who has the legal authority to sign such a document?
Sure, yeah. I think the most common confusion in that regard is not to distinguish that the armistice is a document signed between military commanders, whereas a peace agreement is a document that's signed between the political governments. And so part of the confusion is also due to the fact that North Korea insisted on having a peace treaty only with the United States during the Cold War. And that is a past era, as we see with the Panmunjom Declaration, where both Koreas agreed that they should be part to a peace agreement. The previous conception was that there should be peace between North Korea and the US, and then some sort of reunification arrangement between the two Koreas. Now the focus is on having the parties that are most at risk of using force, that is to say the two Koreas and the United States, inside all negotiating a peace agreement. And there is the option of including China insofar as China is still the formal military ally of North Korea, even though it normalized relations with the US and with South Korea years ago. And especially as US-China rivalry picks up, to have China included in that table could help the stability of the agreement. So I'd be looking at those four parties most specifically, China being optional depending on how diplomacy goes.
Thank you for your brief answer to a very potentially long discussion. The next question addresses, it's another composite. People are curious about everyday citizens' perspectives in different parts of the countries that are affected by the ongoing division and conflict. So when we look at the two Koreas, if panelists might think about what needs to be done to induce people to change, one of you mentioned mentality, change the mentality. People mentioned to move away from a military first posture in dealing with North Korea, if you're outside of North Korea. And of course, if you're inside North Korea, they too look at military first postures in dealing with the rest of the world, at least in terms of preparedness. So how do you get people who have had decades and decades of imbibing, of absorbing militarized cultures, values, and lifestyles, and seeing the other as an enemy? How do you change that? How do you induce them to think about peace and to move toward peace? I won't ask every person to contribute an answer, but just invite those who have a thought to share. I'll give you a moment to think, and if someone wants to volunteer,
I definitely do. This is something I feel very strongly about. It's first and foremost leadership, because you've got to have somebody who has the vision to see what can be and is not stuck behind what has been. And that's, it's going to take multiple leaders on multiple levels. But, the United States is in the most powerful position, and they have the most opportunity to provide that kind of new leadership. Moon Jae-in, of course, as I mentioned just a minute ago, he certainly has some of that desire, but it's going to be really hard. And that's why it takes such strong leadership, because they're so deeply ingrained, as you just mentioned, both in North Korea and the United States, about a military first focus. And that's so hard to change. But without really consistent and persistent leadership, it's just hard for me to see how we're going to get there. But that can work if we can find it.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I think one of the most, oh, go ahead,
Adam.
Jessica, please.
Adam, Hazel, and Jessica, sorry.
Thanks. I think one of the most remarkable things that strikes me about Colonel Davis's remarks is that these recent summits have demonstrated that we can start to make this change in mentality towards diplomacy. It's remarkable how far Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump got in terms of at least building different optics around the relationship, and that they did so with relatively sort of acceptable political costs. Now, if that kind of diplomacy started to yield some tangible benefit, I think it would become even more politically palatable. In the United States, Democrats in Congress and Republicans in Congress would really need some cues from a presidential administration that was devoted to building a more effective approach towards North Korea. Unfortunately, it would sort of become politicized if it were a Democratic president doing this. But that's really the way forward, is to demonstrate value from, in terms of tangible security benefits, from the sort of opening phases of a peace regime process that sort of builds towards a declaration and more robust sort of peace agreements.
Thanks. Hazel, you had something to share. Hazel, if you would unmute.
With technology. I took the questions to mean to be addressed to thinking about the peoples in North Korea and South Korea rather than the diplomatic negotiators.
Yes.
My view from the North Korea side is that all this change in mentality has been going on for the last 20 years anyway. If you're a young person growing up in North Korea today, if you're say under 35, the way that North Korea used to run itself under Kim Il-sung, when absolutely everything was under state control, including food, including income, everything, that's history. And you know, when I teach my students in international relations, it's the same. The Cold War. I grew up in the Cold War, but my students is just history. And we forget that the North Korean politics might not have changed very much, but the society has changed considerably over the last 25 years. It's a marketized society with different norms, different aspirations, different ways of doing things. So I think that sort of mentality has changed anyway. And also we've got plenty of examples where very rapid change in ideology at the top led to quite smooth transitions at the bottom. And that's of course the transformation of communist states to democratic states of different forms in Eastern Europe. It wasn't all clear. We had the Balkans where many people did get killed, but surprisingly, it was a pretty smooth transition in most countries. And what the reaction was, and I think most people feel like this in their daily lives, is that if we have the opportunities to make a better future for our children, to have jobs, to have investment, to have not have queues in the supermarkets, that's a good thing. The people that suffer are the ones that are at the top of their careers at that time, because they're the ones that can't really go forward. Their histories, or people in their 50s, for instance, their histories with the situation that it was before. But for younger people, it's opportunity, I think.
Excellent, thank you. Jess, did you have something to?
Sure. Yes. You know, just to add to that, Kathy, I think, you know, part of what we do as analysts is to review surveys and polls, right? And of course, South Korea being an open country as opposed to North Korea, I have access to some of the recent polling data, including the one from Korean Institute for National Unification, Keynote. And their survey found that 60% of the respondents say that U.S. forces Korea is not necessary at all or somewhat necessary, which is a 12% increase from last year. And what's also interesting is the decline in support for USFK after unification of the two Koreas, which means that South Koreans don't necessarily view US troop presence as a permanent one. It's more of a temporary solution in some of these people's minds. But I want to kind of get to, I think, the heart of your question, which is that, you know, for so many Koreans on both sides of the peninsula, the education and the politicization of the relationship is real. And it also, I think, is tied to what Washington has done to really promote an anti-communist agenda. And I'm referring in particular to Vincent Bevan's recent book, Jakarta Method, and how Washington has really systematically shaped a foreign policy and a worldview that is decidedly anti-communism. And so for South Koreans, I mean, North Korea, represents something that's, scary and undesirable in that sense of ideology. And so to your point, and I think what the questioners are getting at is, it's going to take a lot of time for people to get comfortable with the idea that in countries like Vietnam, that we have relations with, even though they're a communist country, that it's okay to talk to a country whose government form you may not agree with. Because they are, they have no choice. Their geography is such that they're going to have to learn to live with each other. And so I think this is going to take a very long time, if not generations.
Hazel, could I press you a little bit to think about North Koreans? How do we access possible transformation among North Koreans? Jessica mentions the education system or educational content and messaging. How possibly could we even think about doing that with North Koreans when that would threaten the regime that we'd have to negotiate with?
Well, as I said, I think it's happening already. And when we see COVID, if there's a vaccine and we see trade going back between China and North Korea, with trade, as has happened everywhere in history, between China and North Korea comes ideas and change and different mentalities. Is the sorts of issue that was raised earlier. We can't hope without a big diplomatic change to see everything that we would like to see, the perfect transformation to peace, prosperity, human rights, etc. My view is that it's going to have to, any change will be successful if it comes from below. Those are where the preconditions are in North Koreans. And if we allow, once it's physically possible because of COVID, trade, particularly if we can monitor what's going in, if we have the World Bank going in because their mechanisms are transparent, they have to report back outside, then this itself brings along a momentum in which positive change can take place. And when I say positive change, I mean positive change for North Koreans, positive change for the rest of the world, because they get a bit more familiarity with North Korea. It's not the perfect answer. I don't think there is a perfect answer, in the same way that having a peace agreement just is a little chink in taking movement along away from where we've been for the last 30 years, which has been highly dangerous. If we look back over the last 20 odd years, 25 years, very frequently, and if even we only have to look back to 2017, we've seen people talking about the real dangers of threat of a nuclear war. Now we need to get away from that situation, and so do North Koreans as well. So it's not a very straight answer to what you asked, but I think that that we don't have to create some new scenario. Those things are in place now. China, in the areas bordering North Korea, Northeast China is very developed economically. There's not political freedom, but there's lots of exchange of ideas and the possibilities for North Koreans to learn a lot more about ways of doing alternative things and to have access to ideas. This is completely different from 20, 25 years ago, when China was a poor country and its neighbors, and actually some Chinese, but going further back than that, would come to North Korea, especially during the Chinese famines, in order to get fed. This is not the same now. China's much more open in the civil and political space, and North Koreans have access to China when there's not COVID. So I think we have to go with what's there rather than what we might hope for in some big outcome which doesn't exist in the real world.
Thank you. And I have a question, actually. My own question is, North Korea, South Korea are not the only divided societies, divided peoples in the world, as you all know. What might we learn from the lessons in other parts of the world? For example, Northern Ireland, the Middle East, even Cyprus, North and South are divided. We could look at divided societies in different ways in Latin America, where you have functioning governments without the ability to control or truly govern a large population because of guerrillas and other kinds of separatist groups. So divided societies, there are many. What should we not learn, right? What should we learn that we should not apply to the two Koreas? What might we take as good lessons to try and apply to the two Koreas, if relevant?
Well, I think a really good example is the East and West Germany. I was actually in Germany when they reunited and saw a lot of the things that happened with there. I know I went to Korea just a few years afterwards, and I know they were looking at that a great deal and looking at many of the things that worked, many of the things that didn't work. You know, and I think it has some lessons for this situation here, because the disparity between East and West Germany, which I was able to see firsthand, was pretty dramatic, but it wasn't radically different. I think right now between South and North Korea, you have some radical differences. And I think that any kind of potential for reunification has to intentionally be done much, much slower to bring the two sides into some closer conformity. And of course, the major difference between that was that, you know, West Germany fell apart with the Soviet Union, and there's no situation like that now. So you're going to definitely move forward slower when you have two existing governments that have to somehow figure to come together. But peaceful coexistence and increasing cooperation, increasing economic interaction between the two is a great step to moving toward that direction.
Thanks. Do people have very specific lessons we might consider? For example, when we talk about Germany, integrating the economies, you know, to what extent are there lessons we should not replicate in North Korea, South Korea as a potentially reconciled place? Any takers on continuing with specifics regarding Germany or other aspects of the question I had posed?
Yeah.
Henry.
So I mean, on Germany, there's been a lot that's been written on trying to compare Germany and Korea, but of course the main difference here is that in the German case, it was West Germany absorbing the East, and that makes it a very sensitive and topic to bring up with North Korea, as President Park Geun-hye found out when she tried to raise that example at her speech in Dresden a few years ago. The problem basically is there is a certain conception of trying to impose one system on the other. And the conceptions on which there can be consensus is to try to keep some form of socialism in the North and some form of liberalism in the South. Any discussion that goes towards applying liberalism in the North won't go anywhere. That said, again, yeah, peace and the use of force is a different question than that of reunification. And for one to heal the wounds of the division, there will probably be an extended period of the two Koreas just coexisting.
Thank you. Hazel, please.
Yeah, I mean, this raises all sorts of big questions outside the scope of a peace agreement. You know, what might happen in the future? What might be the things that other peace processes or other divided countries, examples where there's been some movement, what might that, the lessons might be drawn, as you say, but that's beyond, I think, a peace agreement, because in Ireland, for instance, I mean, I lived in London for 20 years, and when I was working in London, the Irish bombing camp, the IRA bombing campaign was in full flow. There was a bus that was bombed just around the corner from my office. My brother was caught up in a bombing in the city of London. I've got very personal experience about what that was like. It wasn't pretty. People were being killed, and the merits of the process, the way it was done, is they did bring together and they did forge agreement between people that were at war with each other militarily in the current generations. It wasn't in the past. It was something where people were being killed. You know, the Tory party conference, there were people, MPs killed, the Conservatives, and they managed to, they had the political will on all sides to come together with people who are not just nominal enemies, but had killed people that they knew. So that was strong political will on all sides to come to an agreement. I don't really see that actually in the South Korea, United States case, but I think if that was there, that would be helpful. Why was it successful? And I think it has been successful, is because they were prepared to say, there's got to be a democratic outcome to this. And so I sort of don't agree with Henri. I think if there was real move for negotiation, you have to say that this is the least we accept, some form of democratic option. And secondly, what they were prepared to do, and why the paramilitaries on all sides, whether it was the Unionists or the Republicans, why they were able to accept that form of democratic option, is because there was institutional integration, so that the police forces and the military up front had quotas of people at every level that were taken from all sides of the community. This is in contrast, for instance, to the de-Baathism that took place in Iraq, when everybody was chucked out. All the Baathists were thrown out of the army, the police force, everything else. And we've seen that that was a complete failure. And so this is an example where it's not a direct analogy. We're not talking about two countries in civil war, but it's a decent enough analogy. This was an example where upfront, very, very difficult political decisions were taken by communities as well as leaders who had their friends and family killed, tortured, abducted in the process, in recent memory, still going on, it wasn't historical, and then were prepared to accommodate the security institutions to allow to bring both sides into those institutions. And this, I think, has laid the basis for a stable peace, which we have seen since then. That takes a lot of political bravery, leadership, and imagination, but it's worked.
Well, the leadership is particularly important because the leader, how much bravery you get is partly contingent on the character, personal and political, of the leader. And I'm thinking of South Africa after apartheid, healing those wounds and having a person like Mandela to lead that process. We don't really have Mandelas on the Korean Peninsula or, around the Korean Peninsula. Maybe we could put that on our wish list if this is wishful thinking. But at any rate, I think we need to move to the conveners who would like to say some closing remarks. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. We've come to the end of our time. Dr. Moon, thank you especially for your skillful facilitation of all the questions that came in. That was really impressive. Of course, this is not really the end. I hope that we keep engaging on these questions and debates and really not shy away from having these conversations with each other, with people who we may disagree with. But I just wanted to thank all of you once again for participating. I want to thank the organizers who have been working behind the scenes. We may be physically distanced across cities and time zones, but I think it's fair to say we're all very present in this work together to create a better future. And please keep an eye out for this forthcoming report in the fall, tentatively titled Path to Peace. It will explore all the issues you heard today in much greater detail. And yes, please take care of yourselves and each other. And that concludes our webinar for today. Thank you so much.